Something feels off, but not in a way you can clearly explain. It's not anxiety in the usual sense, not confusion in the way you've experienced before, and not a complete loss of direction. It's quieter than that, more subtle, almost like a background shift that you can feel but can't fully define. The way you think is changing, the way you react is different, and yet when you try to understand what exactly is happening, nothing seems concrete enough to hold on to. What makes this phase so disorienting is that you are still looking at the same life, the same environment, the same structures around you, but your internal response to all of it is no longer the same. Situations that used to trigger immediate reactions now create a pause. Thoughts that once felt automatic now feel optional. Emotional patterns that used to define your behavior are no longer as convincing. There is space where there used to be certainty, and that space can feel unfamiliar if you don't understand what it represents. At the same time, there is no clear replacement for what is fading. You are not fully connected to a new version of yourself yet. There isn't a solid identity you can point to and say, "This is who I am now." Instead, there is a transition happening beneath the surface, where the old patterns are losing strength, but the new ones have not stabilized enough to become your default way of operating. And because of that, your mind starts searching for something to anchor to, something that feels defined, something that restores a sense of clarity. From a neurological perspective, this is exactly what happens when established neural pathways begin to weaken, while new ones are still forming. The brain is no longer fully relying on familiar patterns, but it also hasn't automated new responses yet. That creates a temporary state where perception becomes less structured. Your usual way of interpreting reality is no longer fully active, and the new way is not yet consistent, which makes everything feel slightly undefined. This is not dysfunction, it is reorganization. From a quantum perspective, this phase represents a shift in the observer itself. You are no longer consistently identifying with the version of you that was reinforcing your previous reality, but you are also not fully stabilized as the observer of a new one. That creates a gap, not in reality, but in identification. You are not fully aligned with the past, and not yet anchored in the future, which means your experience becomes less predictable, because the reference point that used to define it is dissolving. This is why it feels like you don't fully belong to your old life anymore, even though nothing external has dramatically changed. The disconnection is not from your environment, it is from the identity that used to interpret that environment in a fixed way. Without that identity operating at full capacity, your perception becomes more open but also less defined. And for a mind that is used to certainty, that openness can feel like instability. The natural reaction in this moment is to try to resolve that instability as quickly as possible. The mind starts looking for clarity, trying to define what is happening, trying to reestablish a sense of direction or certainty. It may push you to go back to familiar ways of thinking, to reconnect with previous goals, or to recreate emotional patterns that used to feel grounding. Not because those patterns are still aligned, but because they are known, and the known always feels more stable than the unknown. But this is where most people misinterpret the experience. They assume that the discomfort means something is wrong, that they are losing direction, that they need to figure things out or return to something that makes sense again. In reality, what is happening is much more precise. The structure that used to define your identity is dissolving, and your system has not yet finalized a new one. The discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the old reference point is no longer holding. This phase cannot feel fully stable because stability belongs to identity, and identity is exactly what is in transition. Trying to force clarity too early pulls you back into the old structure because clarity, as your mind understands it, is built on what is already familiar. But what you are moving into is not fully familiar yet, and it cannot be understood through the same patterns that are currently dissolving. So instead of asking, "Why do I feel lost?" the more accurate question becomes something else entirely. What part of me is no longer available in the same way, and what is still forming beneath that absence? Because this is not a moment of disconnection from your path. It is a moment where the version of you that needed that path is no longer operating the same way. And until the new identity stabilizes, this in-between will feel real, not because you are lost, but because you are no longer anchored to what you used to be. As this transition continues, something very specific starts to happen internally. The mind begins to react to the loss of structure not with panic but with an attempt to rebuild what is no longer stable. It doesn't want to stay in that undefined space for too long, because its primary function is to organize reality into something predictable, something that can be understood and controlled. So when your identity starts to loosen, the mind interprets that as a lack of structure and immediately tries to compensate. This is where the impulse to figure things out becomes stronger. You may notice yourself overthinking more than usual, trying to analyze what you're feeling, trying to define what changed, or trying to make decisions that bring back a sense of direction. It can even feel productive, like you are gaining clarity or becoming more aware. But underneath that process, there is a subtle resistance to what is actually happening. Because what is happening is not meant to be solved. It is meant to stabilize. From a neurological standpoint, the brain is attempting to return to efficiency. When familiar neural pathways weaken, the system experiences a temporary drop in predictive accuracy. That means your brain is less certain about how to interpret situations, less automatic in its responses, and less confident in its internal models. To compensate, it increases cognitive activity, trying to rebuild a framework that restores certainty as quickly as possible. But the problem is that the only framework it knows how to rebuild is the old one. So even when you think you are moving forward, you may actually be reconstructing parts of the previous identity, just in a more refined way. The same patterns, the same need for control, the same reliance on mental clarity, just expressed differently. And because it feels more conscious, it's harder to recognize that it's still rooted in what is already dissolving. From a quantum perspective, this is where the observer becomes unstable again. Instead of remaining in an undefined but open state, you begin to collapse back into familiar interpretations. Not because they are true, but because they are available. The moment you define your experience using old references, you begin reinforcing the same version of reality that was tied to those references. This is why the in-between phase can feel like it comes and goes. You may have moments of deep clarity, where everything feels quiet and spacious, where you are not over-identifying with thoughts, where your reactions feel lighter and less automatic. And then suddenly you find yourself back in analysis, back in interpretation, back in trying to make sense of everything again. It can feel like inconsistency, like progress followed by regression. But that's not what's actually happening. What you are experiencing is the tension between two systems, one that is dissolving and one that has not fully formed yet. The old identity is trying to maintain relevance, while the new one is still stabilizing. And the mind, caught between both, tries to resolve the tension by choosing what feels more familiar. This is where most people unknowingly slow down the process, not because they go fully back, but because they don't allow the undefined state to exist long enough. They rush to fill the gap with explanations, decisions, and conclusions, which reintroduces structure before the system had time to reorganize naturally. And that premature structure always resembles the past. The key shift here is subtle, but it changes everything. Instead of trying to understand the transition, you begin to allow it. You stop treating the lack of clarity as a problem that needs to be fixed, and start recognizing it as a phase that needs space. That space is what allows the new identity to form, without being shaped by old patterns. Because the new version of you is not built through analysis. It is built through consistency, without interference. And interference at this stage doesn't look like negativity or doubt. It looks like over-understanding. The more you try to define who you are becoming before it stabilizes, the more you limit how it can form. You start forcing it into familiar categories, familiar identities, familiar ways of being that your mind already understands. But what is emerging is not fully compatible with those structures yet. So when you force definition too early, you distort the process. This is why allowing the in-between is not passive. It requires a different kind of awareness, one that does not immediately react to the absence of clarity. It requires recognizing when the mind is trying to rebuild something that is already losing its foundation, and choosing not to follow that movement. Not by force, but by not engaging with it. And when you stop engaging with that need to define everything, something starts to settle on its own. The mind becomes quieter, not because you silenced it, but because it no longer needs to compensate. The system begins to reorganize without pressure, without urgency, without the need to return to something familiar. And that is where the transition deepens. Because now, you are no longer trying to become someone new. You are allowing who you are becoming to take shape without resistance. As this phase continues, another pattern begins to reveal itself, and it's one that most people don't question because it feels natural. Even after recognizing that something is changing internally, there is still a tendency to look for confirmation of who you are in the same places you always did. You observe your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions, and you try to use them as indicators of identity, as if they should clearly tell you where you stand. But what you don't realize is that those indicators are no longer reliable, because they were built for a version of you that is no longer stable. This is where the feeling of being stuck starts to appear. Not because you are actually stuck, but because you are measuring your current state using tools that belong to your past identity. You are expecting clarity to come from the same internal signals that used to define you, but those signals are already changing. They are no longer consistent, no longer predictable, no longer aligned with a fixed sense of self. So when you look inward trying to find certainty, what you encounter is variability, and variability feels like instability. From a neurological perspective, this is what happens when identity-based patterns begin to dissolve. The brain no longer produces the same consistent emotional and cognitive responses that it used to associate with who you are. Instead, it generates a wider range of possibilities because it is no longer locked into a single dominant pattern. That creates flexibility, but it also removes the sense of certainty that came from repetition. And without that repetition, identity feels undefined. From a quantum perspective, this is where the observer is no longer fixed. You are not consistently collapsing reality from one identity, which means your experience becomes less predictable, not because something is wrong, but because the selection process itself is changing. You are no longer reinforcing the same version of reality with the same level of consistency, which creates a temporary sense of disorientation. This is why trying to find yourself during this phase becomes counterproductive, because the version of you that could be found is already dissolving. Every time you ask, "Who am I right now?" and expect a clear, stable answer, you are assuming that identity should already be defined. But at this stage, it isn't. It's forming. It's stabilizing. It's reorganizing at a level that doesn't immediately translate into clear thoughts or consistent emotions. So instead of finding an answer, you find fluctuation. And that fluctuation feels like something is missing. But nothing is missing. What is happening is that you are no longer able to reduce yourself to a familiar pattern. This is where many people unknowingly slow the process. They interpret the lack of a clear identity as a problem, and in response, they try to rebuild a sense of self using what is still accessible. They return to familiar labels, familiar ways of thinking, familiar emotional patterns. Not because those patterns are still true, but because they provide a sense of definition. And definition feels safe. But that safety comes at a cost. Because every time you rebuild a familiar identity, even partially, you reinforce the very structure that is dissolving. You give it relevance again, you give it coherence, you allow it to remain active instead of letting it fully lose stability. The shift here requires a different relationship with identity altogether. Instead of trying to define who you are, you begin to notice what you are no longer reacting as. Instead of asking, "What should I feel right now?" you observe what no longer triggers you the same way. Instead of trying to stabilize a new version of yourself through thought, you allow it to emerge through consistency of non-reaction. And that changes the direction completely, because now you are not building identity from the mind. You are allowing identity to form from what you stop reinforcing. This is subtle, but it is the turning point. The moment you stop searching for yourself in your thoughts, your emotions, and your immediate reactions, you remove the pressure to define something that is still forming. You allow the process to unfold without forcing it into something recognizable too early. And in that space, something begins to stabilize, not as a clear definition, but as a quiet consistency. You start noticing that even without knowing exactly who you are becoming, You are no longer who you were. Your responses remain different. Your reactions don't fully return. Your perception continues to shift in ways that don't require constant awareness. And that continuity is what identity actually is. Not a label, not a fixed description, but a consistent way of being that no longer depends on conscious effort. And the more you allow that consistency to exist without trying to define it, the more it strengthens on its own. Until one day, it no longer feels like you are between anything. It just feels like you. At a certain point, the discomfort of this in-between space starts to become more noticeable, not because it is getting worse, but because your awareness of it is increasing. You begin to recognize that you don't feel fully like your old self anymore, but you also don't feel completely anchored in anything new. And naturally, the mind interprets that as something that needs to be resolved. This is where a very subtle shift happens. Instead of allowing the transition to continue, you begin trying to exit it. It doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like progress. You start looking for ways to move forward, to feel more certain again, to stabilize something that you can clearly identify. You might try to define your next version, create clarity around your direction, or force a sense of alignment that feels solid and consistent. On the surface, this seems like exactly what you should be doing. It feels proactive, intentional, even necessary. But underneath that movement, there is impatience, and impatience introduces interference. From a neurological perspective, impatience signals that the current state is not acceptable. The brain interprets this as a problem that needs resolution, which activates goal-oriented behavior designed to eliminate uncertainty as quickly as possible. That shifts your system out of a receptive, reorganizing state and back into a control-based mode, where the focus is no longer on allowing change, but on forcing clarity. And forcing clarity always pulls from what is already known. So instead of allowing the new identity to emerge naturally, you begin shaping it using old references. You define who you are becoming based on what you already understand, what already feels familiar, what already fits into your previous way of organizing reality. And without realizing it, you compress the process into something smaller than what it was becoming. From a quantum perspective, this is where potential collapses too early. The in-between phase is a space of expanded possibility. You are not locked into a single version of yourself yet, which means multiple versions are still accessible. But the moment you rush to define who you are, you collapse that openness into something specific, something limited by your current level of understanding. And that collapse is not aligned with expansion, it is aligned with control. This is why trying to get out of this phase often makes it feel like you are stuck in it longer. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are interrupting the natural stabilization process. You are not allowing the system to fully reorganize before assigning it a fixed form. It's like trying to finalize a structure before the foundation has settled. The result is something that looks stable, but isn't fully integrated. This is where the 1% move differently. They don't rush this phase. They don't try to define themselves too quickly. They don't force clarity just to feel comfortable again. They allow the discomfort, not passively but consciously. They recognize that the absence of clarity is not a problem to solve, but a stage of transformation. They understand that the mind's need for definition is not aligned with the process that is happening beneath it. So instead of reacting to that need, they observe it, and by not following it, they remove the pressure that would otherwise distort the transition. This is what allows the new identity to form in a way that is not limited by the past. It gives space for something genuinely different to stabilize, something that is not just a modified version of who you used to be, but a fundamentally different way of being that doesn't rely on the same structures. Because real transformation does not come from redefining the old self. It comes from allowing it to dissolve completely. And that dissolution cannot be rushed. The more you try to escape the in-between, the more you stay connected to what you are leaving. But the moment you stop trying to move faster than the process, something shifts internally. The urgency fades, the need to define disappears. And what remains is a kind of stillness that doesn't feel like progress in the traditional sense, but is actually what allows everything to stabilize. This is where the transition deepens. Not when you figure it out, but when you stop needing to. At a certain point in this phase, something begins to shift. Not because you figured it out, not because you found clarity, and not because you finally defined who you are becoming. It happens when you stop trying to do all of those things. It happens when the need to understand starts to lose intensity, when the constant mental movement slows down, and when you allow the experience to exist without immediately turning it into something you need to resolve. This is where the transition stops feeling like confusion and starts feeling like space. Not empty space in a negative sense, but open space. A kind of internal silence where you are no longer rushing to label everything, no longer trying to interpret every sensation, no longer forcing meaning onto what you are experiencing. And in that space, something very specific begins to organize itself without your intervention. Your system starts stabilizing in a way that does not require constant awareness. From a neurological perspective, this is the moment where the brain stops overcompensating. The need to rebuild structure through analysis begins to fade, because the system is no longer perceiving the undefined state as a threat. Without that pressure, new neural patterns have the opportunity to strengthen naturally. They don't need to be forced or repeated aggressively. They begin to integrate through consistency of non-interference. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because now, you are not trying to become someone new. You are allowing the new to become consistent. From a quantum perspective, this is where coherence begins to stabilize. You are no longer shifting between different interpretations, no longer collapsing reality from conflicting states. Even though you may not be consciously defining your identity, the absence of interference creates a stable signal. And that stability is what allows a new version of reality to begin aligning with you. This is why things start to feel subtly different, not dramatically, not all at once, but in ways that are difficult to ignore. You notice that your reactions don't return in the same way, even when familiar situations arise. You notice that your thoughts don't carry the same weight even when they appear. You notice that your need to control, define, and understand begins to dissolve, not because you forced it to, but because it no longer feels necessary. And that is where the new identity begins to take shape. Not as something you declare, but as something you consistently are, without effort.
And maybe, just maybe, you were never lost. Maybe what felt like confusion was actually transformation. Maybe the discomfort, the silence, the feeling of not recognizing yourself anymore wasn't a breakdown. It was a transition. Because in the quantum field, nothing truly disappears. It evolves. And right now, you're not who you used to be, but you haven't fully stepped into who you're becoming. You are between identities. And that space? It's not empty. It's infinite. It's where your old patterns dissolve, and your new reality is being written, thought by thought, choice by choice. So don't rush this phase. Don't panic in the unknown, because the version of you that has everything you've been dreaming of, clarity, confidence, purpose, already exists. And every moment you stay present, aware, and aligned, you are collapsing that reality into this one. So breathe. Trust the process. You're not lost. You're becoming.